Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don is sitting in the driver's seat host chair today and joined by Eric Bond. Eric, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing very nicely, Don.
Good. And joined by Chris Capola. And Chris, I'm suggesting you probably need to say hi to the good people.
Hi to the good people.
There we go. Now it's official. We're in a Fork in Time episode. So appreciate you guys joining us today. It's just going to be the cast of three of us. You know, we sort of go up and down now that we have a team, which is sort of cool, but it'll be the three of us that are here today. And the topic that we're going to hit today, I'm going to let Eric take us to it. But we're going to another part of the world, and good news, it's not Europe, at least not initially.
Or an island off of Europe who can't decide whether they are or aren't part of it.
Yeah, Alexis isn't here to put us in that direction or do what's there. So we're going to go in and we're going to take the adage and we're going to go west, young man. That's where we're going to pick up from here. So Eric, you want to set us up for what we're going to be talking about today?
Absolutely. So I know that it's that time of week. We call it Columbus Day. We call it Indigenous Peoples Day. We call it Leif Erikson Day. But you know who we don't talk about? Portugal. And who is the most famous Portuguese explorer of them all? Well, I got to put it down for our good friend Ferdinand Magellan, Portuguese sailor, this time sailing to the Straits of Malacca, the beloved Spice Islands, to increase trade. He had gotten permission from the King of Portugal to work for another master. Citizenship back then was weird. Citizenship is always weird, you could argue, but he had agreed to let Magellan work for a different state. Magellan chose Spain, which was the wrong choice, but Magellan led a fleet of 5 ships, 270 men. They would eventually circumnavigate the globe. Actually, correction, one ship with 30 people out of 270 people initially would circumnavigate the globe without Magellan. And it was already a, let's say, punchy endeavor to begin with. There were multiple mutinies, acts of scurvy among the crew. And today's fork, we are going to December of 1519. So this will be the first year of that voyage. After trying a boatswain, Antonio Salomon, for sodomy with a cabin boy, a member of the crew, Captain Cartagena, Mendoza, and Quesada, murder Magellan after the trial and decide to turn the ship back towards Spain. They abandoned the voyage. A lot of the members of the crew had problems with Magellan's leadership because he chose weird paths for the ship to go down, such as going down the coast of Africa in order to get around those. I can't remember the name of it, but it's the southern half of Africa. There is a kind of whirlpool that creates an issue for ships voyaging, if I'm remembering correctly, Chris.
We had this discussion. It's basically the Cape of Good Hope.
Yeah.
Down there.
Not to be confused with the Straits of Magellan, which are on the tip of another continent on the south end, even though, so we're talking Magellan, but we're talking Africa at this point, not South America.
Right. So because of the end of this trial going badly for sodomy, there will be no Straits of Magellan, is what I'm saying. This completely upends the first circumnavigation of the globe. Magellan is killed before he is killed in our own timeline by what are later called the Philippine Islanders. And that is where we're going to see how the world turns out. The Philippines have been spared a Spanish/Portuguese encounter for at least 10 years, if not more.
Okay, and just to put a little bit of a punctuation point on what Eric just said, we often talk about Magellan being the one to circumnavigate the world in the real timeline. His expedition circumnavigated the globe. He did not.
No.
So maybe there's a chance for some bar trivia there for somebody if you want to get into some of the details there. He was the first to circumnavigate the globe. Well, Magellan's expedition, but not the actual dude, not the actual guy.
No, there is, however, a children's animated film about Magellan and Elcano, his second in command, who later took full command of the journey. How they made a children's movie about early colonization efforts and murder, I don't know, but hey, that's show business, baby.
Yeah, there you go. The other thing I wanted to mention, because the date jumped out at me, and I'll readily admit, while I'm familiar with the events here in the broad scope of this part of history, this is not my historical wheelhouse in terms of details. So bear with us as we struggle through some of the details. Perhaps if I struggle through some of the details, Eric and Chris, I think, have a better command than I do. But the 1519 date immediately jumped out at me. And the reason the 1519 date jumped out at me, this is when this is happening, is just to put another event that's going on in the world. This is Cortez landing in Mexico. And so, the next 2-year struggle to actually overcome the Aztecs. So these are parallel events in terms of timing in world history. So to give you an idea of, we're fully into the age of discovery, the age of exploration, what might eventually be called the age of exploitation, depending on what your take on this is, colonization. But if we had the version of the evening news that was sort of going on during this period of time, the stuff going on in the Philippines and the stuff going on in Mexico would be playing next to each other at the same time. So we're really getting that true sense of the European powers going, and particularly the European exploration powers going global, is, I think, the point that I want to make there. That's why the 1519 date jumps out at me. What's going on in the Philippines, but also, what's going on in Mexico and what's going on elsewhere. This is all, simultaneous, if that makes any sense. And go ahead, Eric.
For fans of Spanish or Holy Roman history, this will be during the reign of, if you want to say, Carlos I of Spain or Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, to give you some sense of grounding in that time.
Right. And this is, and it's also, interestingly enough, this is also the period roughly of the start of the Reformation. Is also going on in this same rough time frame as well. Lots of stuff happening around the world. So
1519, what a heck of a time to be alive.
Yeah, not if you're Magellan, because you're going to die twice.
No.
He dies in the real timeline. He's going to die here. So we mentioned our point of departure, Eric, is going to be associated with the event of what actually happened here. And so there was a mutiny among the expedition. So we've decided to use the mutiny as the fork, right?
That is correct. So 3 of the 5 captains, including Magellan for his expedition, were Spanish or Castilian, as they would have called themselves at the time. And they had issues being led by a Portuguese. As I kind of alluded to earlier, being a citizen of a country was still a different concept, because we're coming out of the feudal period in which for instance, if I was born under a certain duchy, I would technically be considered the property of whoever my feudal lord was at that time. So the fact that Magellan got permission to basically be leased to another kingdom, it's a very strange concept. It's kind of like how someone described that movie about the New World by Terrence Malick, where they basically said, basically all the guys who showed up in North America and South America were slightly more than just crusaders with guns in terms of their mentality and their time period.
Yeah.
I don't know that they were much different than crusaders with guns, because thinking about, we're talking about how busy a period this is for Spain. for, global exploration, we are 30 years from the Reconquista. Spain was a militarized society built around driving out the Moors.
Right.
And as soon as they did, they blew up on the world stage because technology had basically allowed them to do this. 1492 is also the Battle of Granada, when the Moors are finally pushed out of Spain. And so it reminds me a little bit of the origin of the French Foreign Legion, which was formed right after the Napoleonic Wars, when you've got a whole bunch of people walking around Europe that know how to use guns and don't have anything better to do with themselves.
Yeah. Chris, you just actually put a concept in my head. I knew the 1492 date for Columbus's exploration, the Reconquista. You just actually put something into my head that I hadn't really ever thought of until just now, which is part of the reason I love doing this. This is like them manifesting the Reconquista dividend. In terms of, there's resources, both in terms of men, material. There's going to be resources that are coming because of what's happening in the New World in terms of gold and money, which is changing the equation. We've talked about that before, but it is Spain in its ascendancy.
And the other thing to think about, and we'll eventually we're going to get to some other important things about this. I think we're all familiar here with Dan Carlin and his supernova in the East. It feels a little bit like at this point, Spain is the supernova in the West.
I can see that. And in fact, we will get there because we've already talked about what we talked about on podcast. We will talk about the things that lead up to the things that Carlin is talking about in supernova in the East in terms of what's happening in Asia,
but
hundreds of years down the road. Yeah,
thinking about this in like the 1470s, as Eric just said, there's no such thing as Spain. Nobody would identify as Spanish. So within 2 generations, this identity is formed and takes over the better part of 3 continents. It blows, counting Charles V's Holy Roman, plus the Iberian Peninsula, plus everything in the Americas, they blow up quick.
Yeah.
And they really do kind of have that supernova thing of this massive expansion. And once they expand, they don't really sustain it that well. That's the other part of this.
Well, the other thing to think about is Spain, Castile at this time, if we're being accurate, does set the standard of how colonization will work, because they're really the first power that attempts like a full-scale, even just settlement program into another sphere. I mean, you could argue the Vikings attempted it with Vineland, but this is on a wholly state level, I would argue.
In terms of exporting peninsulares to the Americas?
Yeah.
Okay. And we've talked about this a little bit on other episodes. I'm a little even wondering how much of a colonization effort that was, looking at the proportions of the people that the Spanish Empire largely, yes, they conquered the Aztecs, but then they put them to work in the silver mines. Whatever indigenous people they took over, they used them. So it wasn't a displacement like we've seen in other colonial enterprises.
Right.
And the other place to do, Alexis and I did a I think an episode on this called Montezuma Reversed, which was it's easy to forget. I actually have, looking over at my bookshelf to the left, some of the things that I have on my bookshelf. It's easy to forget. Yes, this is a result of superior weaponry. You might argue superior technology, but germs, man. I mean, so much of what happened here, what enabled this to come into being, was the functionality of, the disease that were brought by the Europeans to the Americas in particular being the best example of this. And we are talking about large double-digit percentages. Historians still argue about what percentage of the native population died as a result of this. But even the most conservative numbers there, put any plague in history to almost to shame. I mean, the reason you're able to do this with a fairly small number, relatively speaking, of people coming over is the decimation of the native cultures through loss of life through disease. And Chris, to your point, then basically enslaving or putting them to work in the enterprises that were beneficial to the European power.
If the phrase military-industrial complex has ever meant anything, it might be best to describe, since a lot of these were seen as joint military business ventures. Even Ferdinand Magellan was promised by the King of Spain, like, okay, so if you find an island, if you find 2 islands, you can be governor of that island. Yeah. Congratulations, you're a governor. Which might be the reason why the Portuguese also tried to arrest Magellan throughout his expedition. They sent 2 fleets of ships after him because, like I said before, he was allowed to work for somebody else, yes, maybe not the Spanish. Maybe they just didn't tell him that particular bit of fine print.
You picked the wrong alternative. You chose poorly.
And ever since then, we've had a thing called a non-compete clause.
There you go.
Yeah.
So let's trace the real. This is one of those cases where making sure we have at least a good base, maybe not deep, but a good base in the real timeline. The what did is important. So what happened in the real timeline was there was an incident, the incident that Eric described, that happens in the area that we know today as the Philippines. By the way, the Philippines get their name from who? They get their name from Philip, which is they get their name from their Spanish overlord there. But eventually, Asia gets divided up among a number of exploring powers that are doing things. But the Spanish presence in the Philippines is established here as a result of this, and sustains for a very long period of time, right?
Correct.
There really is, there's different incarnations of this, but ultimately we get a Spanish possession, which changes hands in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. has its hand in that. See, at least one episode I can think of that Chris and I did where we talk about Admiral Dewey and some of the other fun stuff that goes with that. Learned a little bit about Dewey's Chewies in the process there. And eventually the Philippines is granted its independence, but it's heavily influenced. Eventually it's a place where the U.S. has bases. So it plays a role in World War II. And we come forward with a Spanish influenced Philippines because of Magellan. And we also have all the things that come with that in terms of religion. So very much a Catholic nation. We have the things that happen as a result of how things are aligned there. The Philippines that we know today ties all the way back to as history that begins with Magellan. So that's the history that we know. If they turn back, which is what Eric has suggested here as a result of the mutiny, what's the first thing that happens on our departure? What's the first thing that's really different there, guys?
So the one thing I'd want to say about the Spanish Empire, and to kind of get back to this new idea that you guys are hearing, kind of a stream of consciousness thing that I'm developing of the supernova in the West. There's this like maybe 60-year period where Spain is conquering things. And after that, they kind of rest on their laurels. So they take over the Philippines, they take over all of these possessions, and then they don't keep expanding them. And it gets to the point in 1898 that really the United States is picking off. Many of us are familiar with the Ottomans being referred to as the sick man of Europe. The Spanish American possessions are the Spanish Empire is kind of the sick man of everywhere not Europe. So the U.S. is really picking that off, and I think one of the reasons they even have the Philippines in 1898 is because very quickly after this massive upheaval that's going on, colonization and exploration shift. Opening up trade routes to China and the Spice Islands, you mentioned Malacca, had been the primary focus of the world, this kind of South China Sea area. And I feel like if the world's focus stays there, Spain can't hold the Philippines much longer. But because it does focus to their American possessions in the Caribbean and all these other things, they are able to hold it. But so if they don't take it, there's two possibilities we discussed. The first being the second, I guess, man to circumnavigate the world being, now that we've had the chance to look that up, we know this answer.
It's Sir Francis Drake. But by the way, not loaned out. To borrow a term from modern, especially European sports parlance, he's not loaned out to another country.
To put a fine point on that, I do believe I would at least ask Alexis whether he was English or British. Knowing the difference, this may be something I would have put a point on. However, so if these are the Virginian Islands or the Elizabethan Islands, if these are British possessions,
maybe they're the early version of the Virgin Islands, given the
that is absolutely a possibility. Yes.
Dang it. I tried looking when Francis Drake's circumnavigation because I'm familiar with Japan's invasion of Korea in 1592, and I was trying to think of like, oh, what if they just decide to invade the Philippines instead? But no, he got there between 1577 and 1580.
So if they're a British possession, like I said, this part of the world that was very much had been a hotbed of exploration and becomes a hotbed again later, has kind of taken a back seat. But this is a really good jumping off point for the British into China. Does anybody? I'm going to put a pin in the big reveal for me. If it stays a British possession. Speaking of Japan invading things, Eric, it's a British possession come 1941 when Europe's at war and Japan decides to move south. Now, in our timeline, when Japan moves south, they're looking at the Dutch East Indies, they're looking at British Malaya, they're looking at French Indochina. I do realize I used a lot of European names, though I'm still talking about Asia. And they decided to attack the United States because we controlled the Philippines. And from the Philippines, we threatened their shipping routes to all of these new places they were interested in taking over. If the British are in the Philippines, there's absolutely no reason for the Japanese to get involved in a war with the United States. They are facing three European powers that are either fighting for their lives or the metropole has already been overrun. These places in our timeline fell very quickly to the Japanese. So I think they can just walk in and take it. And as the other part, the United States doesn't get involved in the war.
Or at least as we talked about actually off podcast. And we're probably going to post part of that, not the very first part. We may post part of that for our Patreon folks there to sort of see the discussion that we had offline there. But the other thing that just popped into my head, again, a lot of this is stream of consciousness. This is one of those episodes we've talked around but didn't talk a lot about before we started recording, is that, I can imagine under this scenario, if the British are in possession of whatever the Philippines are going to be called, because they wouldn't have been called the Philippines. They would have been called something else. I like the idea of the New Virgin Islands, but
or by the way, if we really wanted to get meta about this, we could have the whole circumstance where Elizabeth marries Philip, and they still become the Philippines.
they still become the Philippines in an entirely different way. But the thing that occurs to me there, and of course later will be Captain Cook's exploration and his expedition, the Hawaiian Islands.
Mhm.
And so I could easily imagine a scenario where if you have a English British controlled Philippines, I can imagine a scenario where, among other possessions in the Pacific, the English hold on to and maybe do some different things around the Hawaiian Islands. So to your point, even more so, Chris, maybe there's not even American bases, or the Hawaiian Islands are not even American possession at that point, because that's all just part of more of the English British sphere in the Pacific, for the things that play out over a couple of centuries after Drake's voyage, and subsequently what happens with Cook and what happens with others, where England, in addition to being a power globally, as the empire that they were, is very much more a Pacific power during that period of time, for the reasons that you just elucidated there, in terms of the Philippines being, does Hong Kong exist in the same way if the Philippines are a base, for example, to engage with China?
I think it does, as a entree point to China. I think the role of the Philippines becomes a little bit like the role of Cuba in the United States Caribbean strategy, as a shield for Panama. The other thing I would think about is it cannot be lost, the distance between where we're talking and the Hawaiian Islands. We're all familiar,
the Pacific, the big ocean,
with the Battle of Midway.
Yeah.
Midway is, while not technically a Hawaiian island, I mean, geologically, it is a Hawaiian island. There's the Hawaiian Ridge, and it's one of the almost mountaintops that peaks out of sea. Right. And it is named Midway because it is midway between San Francisco and, I believe, Tokyo or Japan, or the Asian mainland. These are vast distances, and I feel like with British involvement in South China Sea and in China, they would have been interested in exploring, but I don't know if there's the pull to draw the kind of involvement to Hawaii. And the other thing is, I feel like this is just something else that the United States is going to take when the Pacific starts becoming important again.
May I suggest a third prong of the fork?
Sure.
Okay, what if Suleiman the First, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent, decides, you know what, let's go east to explore, since we're unable to use the Indian Ocean just because of the presence of different orders of knights. I believe the Knights of Malta, eventually, though they were based at a different island beforehand. What if they decide, let's also try to get in the game, and then going through the east through their contacts in the Sultanate.
Probably using Basra is what you're thinking?
Yeah,
okay.
Through Basra. And then we have an Ottoman Philippines.
Well, and you mentioned earlier, Eric, while we were talking before the podcast started, about and this is still true today, of much of that portion of Asia. There's a mixture in terms of religion there there's a lot of diversity there. There have been Christian influences because of, in our real timeline, because of the exploration that's there. But by the way, both Catholic and Protestant. The Dutch had a role there too, in addition to the to the English, being Protestants, and of course the Spanish being Catholics, and the Portuguese as well. But you have, today you have very strong Islamic presence, Muslim presence throughout a number
the country
of
with the largest Islamic population is Indonesia.
Yeah. And so I could certainly see a scenario where, because of not just the economic benefits that would have fallen to the Ottoman Empire, but also the religious aspects of what might have been there and what might have sparked, either preemptive or responsive action to other things that are going on, as the case might be. I think you could easily imagine a scenario where there's a different mix of players in this alternative Asia.
Plus, it might save Suleiman a couple of headaches not trying to go after Vienna. If it's like, okay, well, I have this whole other part of the globe essentially to himself, since a lot of the predominant powers in Asia of the time, the Song dynasty, Japan is still in a state of the Sengoku Jidai, which is that civil war period. India is a collection of sultanate and Rajus. These are all fairly, in the Kingdom of Korea, were all fairly insular polities who didn't go after each other, mostly because everybody just wanted to keep to themselves. Now, whether that was a more stable international policy than what was going on in Western Europe, that's up for debate.
I would think it's a little bit more of that idea we've been dancing around about the supernova in the West of a militarized state, a state bringing so much of its power to the military sphere that allowed the Europeans to do it. And if I'm thinking about Suleiman, I don't know that he makes it past India. Not from a inability to, but from that's a very tempting target that does have significant Islamic influences from the Mughal Empire. Why am I sailing around this entire subcontinent and ignoring it when it's, as you pointed out, somewhat ripe itself?
That's fair.
So in the short, I'm trying to, short term, medium term, long term get hard to figure out here when we're talking about events that happened. Well, the events that happened 500 years ago now, and some of the events we're talking about, even the ripple events, are, moving quickly towards being 100 years old. But so I'm going to call the near term. Let's call it the 16th and maybe the 17th century. So the early 1500s. This happens in the 1520ish time frame. Drake is the 1570s if you take the alternative here. So that carries us well into the 1600s. What's different without this Spanish influence in the early part of that, the short term after our fork? I mean, is there anything that is really just so noticeably different that you think it needs to be called out more than maybe we already have? We've talked about, Spain not having the same possession there. Eric has suggested maybe there's more of an independent flair to what the Philippines become in terms of not being, their indigenous rulers, happen because there's no external influence. Is there anything big in that first 200 years that just really jumps out that we haven't already mentioned?
I would say Spain doesn't really change all that much with or without the Philippines. They're still going to have runaway inflation. They're still going to be concerned with the Reformation going on in Europe, that it's like they got a Portuguese guy who said, I really, really want to go to the Straits of Malacca. Can I please borrow some ships? But they weren't thinking of it themselves as far as we know, independently of just like, man, I really want to see what's going past South America. To them, it was just like, yeah, I guess, go ahead. If you find some stuff, you can be governor of it. If you don't find some stuff, well, we'll see you when you get back.
Is there more clash? Or, I mean, I think of that period of time as being very much aligned along the axis of where the clash is, partly tied to what's going on with the Reformation as well. I think of it as being England and Spain contesting for a lot of things. That's my simple version in my head. I know it's far more complex than that. Is there anything about changing the column for the Philippines, let's just say, that alters that in a substantial way? Or is it just there's plenty of other things that are shifting around. So that just makes small ripples, small changes.
I think there's one thing we talked about our podcast that might be really interesting, and I'm developing it even further now. The Dutch Republic, which is currently breaking away from the Holy Roman Empire, having the whole Dutch Revolution, is in Indonesia today, Dutch East Indies, for some of what we're talking about. There's an island off of China, which may or may not be part of China, which literally drew its name from the Portuguese referring to it as Beautiful Island or Formosa. Most of us probably know it as Taiwan. And so I think without I've kind of said this area turned into a little bit of a imperial backwater, but it's possible that with the Portuguese influence in Formosa, Taiwan, by the way, which also was very important in talking and in providing gunpowder and some other technological advances to Japan, as Eric was just talking about the first period of Western opening with them. There's nothing that says the Philippines have to be a single political entity. They are a group of massive islands.
That is true.
So a Mindoro, southern Philippines with the Dutch, the northern Philippines being Portuguese, does provide an interesting, possibility that it may wind up in both camps, both Protestant and Catholic, and here they're abutting each other again. I think that has interesting possibilities for even the 30 Years' War. They wound up on different sides of that. Going forward into the Napoleonic Wars, they wound up on different sides of that. And just to throw another thing out there that I find very interesting is you do have China right next door, that the European powers that we talk about having this amazing capacity to fight against each other somehow, a la Boxer Rebellion, always wind up working together when it comes to taking down China. Somebody, if you actually have competition in the South China Sea, somebody's going to make a play for China and bring China as an entity into this.
And you say early under that scenario, the fact that it happens and it happens far earlier.
If you have a divided Philippines, you have all of these. This is really setting up, like, Charles V's reign sets up a series of European-wide wars that go through to the Napoleonic. But I'm that persnickety person who insists on referring to the French and Indian War as the American front of the 7 Years' War.
Yeah.
Now,
This is Charles V is the beginning of these, with the 30 Years' War, with Spanish secession, Austrian secession, all of these wars, and they all carry over into their colonial possessions. You see this. Cuba has been occupied by the British multiple times because of what you were talking about, Don. The British and the Spanish are constantly fighting each other. So I'm thinking, closing your eyes and imagining, you've got these European backwaters, but they're fighting each other. And you've got a massive polity to the north. I don't see how one of them doesn't call upon that to help them. And what does that do for China's development? Does it preclude the period where the Europeans somehow magically work together to take down China? What does that mean for China's development? Is this another Ike episode where we're going to have to come back to it?
Well, I think that it is, and we will in a couple of different ways. One of the things we've talked about, just to give our listeners more of a sense of this, is we want to spend more time exploring this part of the world and this time frame particular. And so, when you've already mentioned China, you've mentioned Japan. there's interesting forks all over the place there that we haven't touched as a podcast now, and approaching 160 episodes that we will come back to. So I think we will find our way back here and find our way back soon for the reasons that we will, because these are things that are, we were joking on podcast. I'm not going to do the great reveal. I'm not going to let Chris do it. Chris has already alluded to it. December 7th, 1941 maybe is not a date, that we even think about in the way that we do now, because if you erase Magellan just in a different way, we're still killing Magellan, no matter, to borrow that Bill O'Reilly, we're killing Magellan here. We're just doing it in a different way. But
by the way, how many of his killing center around this period too? Or the period where I jumped to, but yeah.
So I think it is relevant, because it's relevant for as I said, I asked her, what's the near-term impact of this? The near-term impact we're talking about is real. To some degree, the 30 Years' War was a global war in the sense that the powers that were involved had possessions around the world, and but not in the way that we think of World War I, or certainly not in the way that we think of World War II, ballooning into a true.
But over the course of the next century, by the time we're fighting the 7 Years' War, there is fighting in India. There is fighting in the Americas.
Right. So I guess where I'm going with that, does that happen a century earlier in this different formation, where you have different things adjacent to each other in different ways?
Or does this just open another spinning plate that if you're Pitt the Elder, you got to keep up somehow?
Yeah. And again, there are important things there. I also, in a simplistic way, which is on me, I tend to think about the power of especially the Spanish conquest into the Americas as being about all that gold, because that gold alters the balance of power in Europe in a lot of ways. But the resources that are there's a reason that these countries have been seeking to open up trade routes to the east, because there are valuable things there, spices and natural resources that will become even more valuable over time. Hence the reason the Japanese need to move south to get access to things that are modern age resources in the terms of petroleum products. But it's not that these areas don't have merit in and of themselves for being contested over just because of what's there to contest, separate from all of the other quote unquote European issues, including a division inside of Christianity that all these powers are fighting about.
Yeah. But shall we thank our sponsor for this episode, the United East India Trading Company, the VOC. Thank you to our Dutch friends from the VOC, the company of faraway lands.
Yeah.
Many spices.
Well, and the interesting thing that I don't know if this was actually while we were recording yet or when we were talking before we started recording, but the Dutch East India Company is a fascinating concept to me, that the more I learn about it, as an adult, in the sense that it has the economic / political element that it does, and those things are you guys can see me using my hands. They're all mixed together in a way that is ironically modern. That's actually the thing that I think about when I come to that, in terms of how just how there's the alignment of political and economic interests there that I tend to think of as being more of a 19th and 20th century phenomena than I do as something from several hundred years before, if that makes any sense. I don't know what relevance that has, except to say that I think you would have more of that type of activity going into this area of Asia from all the powers, where they're looking to capitalize on what's there, and there's an economic element to it, and there's a political element to it, obviously, as well. So, Chris, did we prevent a world war here somehow still?
No.
I know we can't. I know.
Well, by the way, there's which one? There's one, there's two, there's the 7 Years' War, which I just got done saying should have been considered a world war. There's all of these other tiny little, there's Austrian secession, Spanish secession, all of these other wars, which, by the way, we just said might have turned into world wars with multiple theaters. Please define your terms.
What I have come more and more, particularly in the last decade, is in my own mind, I don't think of the Great War and World War II as being separate conflicts. I think of them as being a continuous stream of conflicts that were a continuous conflict that was interrupted by some fairly long periods of ceasefires and armistice for part of the theater of operations, because it wasn't for everybody during that period of time.
And when you really think about the 30 Years' War, it's also really interesting because you do have entire theaters shutting down and people changing sides. Everything you do see in I guess the second 30 Years' War.
There's a concept.
May I quote you guys something from the governor of the Dutch East India Company?
Absolutely.
He was justifying his basically genocide of people living in the Moluccas. He argued that it was necessary to wipe out the indigenous population. He had an idea about replacing them with Dutch workers, essentially. But he was justifying it to the Board of Governors of, there's no trade without war, and there's no war without trade.
I'm being perfectly honest. I thought you were presaging a good 300, 400 years beforehand, and you were about to say we needed to destroy the villages to save them.
No, I'm not that German.
But the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? I mean, that's the actually my favorite quote here of the last couple of weeks is, attributed to Twain. A lot of things are attributed to Twain, whether he actually said them or not. But supposedly he's the one that said history doesn't repeat, but it very often rhymes. Concept. This is one of those instances of history and a rhyme here, so often. So further down, have we missed any of the bigger? I mean, pretty big wave. In terms of the ripple there, in terms of changing maybe the precursor to what we know as World War II, or the second phase of the whatever we have. We'll continue to use the appropriate names, I guess, just to keep our listeners straight. But any other big things that we missed here that were the ripples?
No shoe collection in the Philippines.
Yeah,
presidential palace.
Okay, we potentially would lose the Marcos influence on fashion in the 80s, and I guess that was in the 80s that happened there. And the Philippines have long been what's the word I'm looking for here? They were a hotbed of revolution in a lot of instances all the way through it. In your mind, Chris, is you talked about the fact that we think of them as being one unified. They're islands. They're a set of islands, a number of islands. It's possible that the way that we draw the map today, they're not even under one big. They're not all the same color on the map.
Right.
This may be the divided element as well. So
right,
we may have a different, again, what we call the modern Philippines might be a different political entity or set of entities, as the case might be. The other thing that ran into my head, this is really far afar, was I've been reading a lot more and thinking a lot more, particularly about South American history in the 19th century. And so the first thing I start going to is, is there some Asian version of a Bolivar here, that's able to unite some of these different nations, or if they have a different history, are they able to be united either because of language or culture in a way that you might see the emergence of some type of, larger political entity that comes to become a union out of some of these reshuffled, redivided parts of Asia. Either as a result of China's influence or response to China, or whatever the case might be there. Could we have something that looks like a larger entity politically that exists over in Asia because of a change here?
I don't think so, and I'll say why. If you hear about Americans' view of Vietnam, where we expected the Chinese communists to be helping out the Vietnamese communists, it completely ignores all of the history of Anand and Tonkin. the European involvement in this area is a lot more surface, is a lot thinner on the ground than it is in South America. In South America and in Latin America, the Spanish came in and they largely were somewhat successful in subsuming the local cultures and merging it into something else. That did not happen at all in East Asia whatsoever. So when you look at when the British leave, there's immediately communal violence in India. When you look at when the French leave, there's communal violence in Indochina. When these European powers leave, like like you're talking about in Spanish South America, leaving's not quite the appropriate word. Actually, I think it's a very interesting concept of when the metropole gets taken over, because that is what triggers a lot of what's going on in Bolivar's generation when Napoleon takes over Spain, when Hitler takes over France, the Netherlands, and these other European powers. There isn't the people there still remember that they hate the people on the other islands.
Yeah, to me, this is one of the lessons of history, and I know we've gone far afield here of what we started with. It seems like an odd place. We spent very little time talking about Magellan, although all of this flows from what happens as a result.
Or Argentina. When was the last time we mentioned Argentina in this entire episode?
In the entire history of the podcast, we may have only mentioned them in passing a couple of times. But it is that sense of what's the word I'm trying to look for here? It is that sense of, one of the things I'm struck by is I mentioned lines on a map or colors on the map, the things that are grouped together, is that, that is a very Western way of looking at things in terms of how the Western powers, European powers, historically over time have imposed lines on maps that had nothing to do with what the natural boundaries were. In some cases geographically, in other cases culturally, religiously, or otherwise, where it's, why are these all one country? Well, because somebody's sitting 3,000 miles away, drew a map and didn't realize who was inside the boundary, kind of thing.
Kind of like how we impose our ideas of, well, Ferdinand Magellan was a citizen of Portugal, but if you asked him, he would say, what's Portugal? Or his captains, what's Spain? We even draw lines on our own ancestors that they wouldn't recognize either.
Or more so, in reference to what tomorrow is, Columbus Day. Where was Columbus? Would Columbus have identified? Columbus wasn't Italian. He would not have identified as Italian. Today, people from the same town he is from might identify as Italian.
It's Eric makes an excellent point, how we apply labels and then how we attach meaning to the labels that should have never been applied in the first place is sort of the way that I would play that out in terms of how this plays as far as an understanding of history. And Straits of Drake, is that what we'd be calling, even the way we name places on the map. I guess thinking this through, at any point did Magellan pass through those straits? Do I have my history right in my head here, Eric and Chris? Do we call them straits?
He passed through them.
He passed through them going in one direction.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, but he didn't come back now, did he?
He didn't come back, he did. Yeah. So but it's interesting that, even how we name things in our modern context, picks up what's there. All right. Eric, you suggested this topic. This was a good one. And to Chris's point, I think we'll find ourselves coming back to it at some point with tangential things that flow in that part of the world. One of the things we've committed to as a team is to spend some more time investigating a lot of the forks of history that exist in Asia in particular, but not even just in modern Asia. We spend a lot of times talking about, 20th century Asia for the reasons that we have, but there's lots of good stuff that goes back further than that. Any other comments before I close this out here? You guys didn't realize, but you triggered something there when we were talking about Turkey in the role of the sick man of
Mhm.
Europe concept there. I had mentioned on a couple other things I'm just going to mention here in passing as we start doing some of the closeout stuff. One of the things that we're encouraging our listeners who may have familiarity with the game to do is the game Diplomacy, which has existed for a little over 50 years now, actually longer than that now that I think about it. But part of the reason that this popped into my head around that Turkey reference is the classic version of that game is sort of 7 European powers leading up to World War I. And so I am playing in a game now where I am playing Turkey as it's identified in the game. And when somebody said, what if Turkey went east? Well, the problem is on that map and in that game, that's not an option for Turkey in the classic version of that game. The first 2 countries you come into conflict with are Russia to your north and the Balkans, which are basically left open and are an area to fight over, and where you're going to encounter either the Italians or the Austrians as you work into that space. But when I just mentioned that because we're still encouraging our listeners to have an interest in that game, maybe a familiarity with it. By the way, if you don't have a familiarity with it, go to the website. There's a couple of pages there. You can see the links to where we're playing those games and come and join us. Now, this is a chance to play through at least that one historical scenario, which is the classic scenario of that game, which is the events leading up to World War I. But there are a number of variants that also exist where Turkey could go east. And so if this is something that you find interesting, part of the ways that we're starting to engage with our listeners now is in that environment, playing together, not just talking together, but playing together. So if any of that sounds intriguing to you, whether you know the game or not, I would encourage you to visit the website. The other thing that we've set up is our Discord server, which for those of you that are familiar with Discord know that it's a way, ironically, for gamers to communicate is how it first came into being, but it now exists for a lot of communities to communicate. And we have a number of our listeners who have come to our Discord site. So we're starting to engage in conversations there. We're doing some topical suggestions that are coming there, discussion of topics, feedback on episodes. So if you haven't found us yet on Discord, you may not visit there frequently, but I would encourage you to do that. There's some good discussion going on there. We have some very, very, very intelligent, witty, informed, funny listeners. And so the chance to interact with them as we've had the chance to do so in various means over time is something that we can all enjoy. So and invite you to our Discord server. We'll be coming up here soon, sort of teasing some future episodes, coming back to our Living Constitution series. We'll be setting up the next set of recordings with our guest Bo Breslin there. So that's an exciting part of what's going on with what's happening there and just all kinds of other stuff. Again, I encourage you to visit the website. I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. And there's all kinds of links to use podcast ease in the show notes if you want to go there. So a lot of exciting things happening, good suggestions for topics, a lot of fun going on. We've done a little bit more whimsy topics here in the last couple of months, which I enjoy. We'll continue to mix those in with the deeper historical stuff here as well. Chris, anything to say to the good people?
Goodbye to the good people.
Well, that's not your tagline. I'm not going to create a second tagline for you. Eric, I'm going to throw to you for our traditional show close here in the absence of the podcast's co-founder. So we suggest to our listeners, if they happen upon that proverbial fork in time, what should they do?
Take it.
Take it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.